has had a very busy past few weeks. We look forward to your testimony. A budget is a statement of values. It makes clear what we prioritize. President Biden's budget would lower costs for households, strengthen Medicare, and protect Social Security. It would invest in our kids and our families and in our communities. It would reduce the deficit, and it would make our corrupted tax code fairer. It is decidedly not a budget for creepy billionaires and fossil fuel overlords. It is a budget for families. The investments proposed in this budget are more than worthwhile. They are overdue. I challenge anyone to say it's not worthwhile to make investments in our kids. The Biden budget would increase child care options for 16 million more kids, lower costs for parents, fund pre-K access for all 4-year-olds, and restore the full child tax credit, which we beta tested and saw work wonderfully well through COVID. I challenge anyone to say it's not worthwhile to ensure workers can care for a child or a loved one and still keep a steady paycheck. The Biden budget would guarantee up to 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave, bringing the United States in line with our peer countries around the world, all of whom guarantee paid leave. I challenge anyone to say it's not worthwhile to reduce the astronomical cost of prescription drugs and college education, to improve Medicaid's home and community-based services, and to reduce costs for homeowners and renters. To accomplish all this and more, the Biden budget would stop the freeloading by large corporations, by the wealthiest families in our country, and by firms that pollute the environment and won't clean their mess. Ending tax breaks for corporations sending profits offshore and outsourcing American jobs reduces the deficit by over $1 trillion. Ending nearly $100 billion in wasteful tax breaks for the fossil fuel industry and hundreds more billions in subsidies to big pharma not only helps the deficit, but is the right thing to do. Our corrupted tax system currently has teachers and firefighters paying higher tax rates than billionaires. The Biden budget puts a 25% minimum tax on those who earn over $100 million annually. The president's budget would extend Medicare solvency by 25 years, in part by asking the wealthy to contribute a little more to Medicare and by closing loopholes that allow those at the top to contribute less than nurses and cashiers. I plan to introduce legislation including this common sense proposal. These investments and these remedies to our tax code are worthwhile on their own merits. Put them all together and they also reduce deficits by almost $3 trillion. This is a bright contrast to the dark House Republican plan to attack popular programs that promote economic growth, a plan that hides its evil effects behind political rhetoric like woke and weaponized. A plan where the math doesn't add up and wealthy donors keep getting their free ride. The new House majority has said it will make permanent the Trump tax giveaways, over 40% of which go to the top 5%, at a cost to the country of $3 trillion over a decade. According to a letter Senator Wyden and I received yesterday from the Congressional Budget Office, the Republican promise to balance the budget in 10 years while extending the Trump tax giveaways and imposing draconian cuts to the programs that boost economic well-being is, in a word, impossible. Mathematically, it cannot be done. Even if Republicans were to zero out everything but Social Security, Medicare, Veteran Services, and defense, that means eliminating 100% of the funding for public safety, border security, Medicaid, environmental protection, health care, treatment for opioid addiction, and so much more. They would still not be able to meet their own goal of balancing the budget. What they would be able to do is make nearly every family worse off and send our economy into a tailspin. So, okay, if that's what House Republicans really want, they should own it, champion it through the regular legislative order the Constitution provides, not by stealth, not with debt limit threats, not by trying to force some covert backroom deal to gut popular federal programs. Here's our choice: President Biden's pro-growth investments, which also reduce the deficit by nearly $3 trillion, versus spending cuts deep enough, economists believe, to plunge the U.S. into a recession, coupled with extending the Trump tax giveaway and adding $3 trillion to the deficit. Families versus creepy billionaires. Economic opportunity and fiscal responsibility versus chaos and corruption. Seems like an easy choice. We welcome the debate. Ranking Member Grassley.
Well, first of all, I appreciate your holding this hearing, and I hope it's the first of many more that we'll have discussing the nation's finances. And Director Young, I welcome you to this hearing as well, because we all know you have a very, very not only important job, but a difficult job. Some decades ago, when federal government was staring at maybe something as small as $200 billion budget deficits, there was then a Senator, Joe Biden, warned of quote unquote economic disaster unless Congress took quote unquote dramatic action on deficits right now. Senator Biden called for getting a grip on federal spending and limiting its growth with a temporary government-wide spending freeze. That's right, including COLAs. He called for reviewing the efficiency and necessity of government programs, and he pushed for changes to the budget process that would improve accountability and make it harder for presidents to pass the buck. Today, we face a far dire situation, and President Biden ought to borrow from Senator Biden's playbook. You might be interested in reading, none of you are going to do it, but May the 2nd, 1984, when this across-the-board budget freeze called the Grassley, Kassebaum, Biden-Baucus budget freeze passed the Senate by a one-vote margin. You might want to read about the hour-long speech that now President Biden and Senator Biden gave during that debate. Unfortunately, the president's budget proposal continues to take our nation down a path of fiscal and economic ruin. The White House referred to this budget as Biden's vision for the future of America. Let's talk about what that vision looks like. President Biden is proposing levels of debt, deficits, and spending previously reserved for times of world war or recession. President Biden's vision for the future is job-killing tax hikes, cradle-to-grave entitlement proposals. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the same proposal members of his own party rejected last Congress, as they called it too extreme. The president uses sleight of hand to claim he's reducing the deficit. Well, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projections, cumulative deficit between 2021 and 2031, that 10-year window, will be $6 trillion higher than what was projected when Biden took office. President Biden's new spending priorities are on track to put even more on our already maxed out credit card. President Biden's vision for the future is a continuation of his administration's assault on fiscal health of our nation during times of economic uncertainty. Annual deficits were always expected to decline from pandemic levels because we put emergency programs in place, and those emergency programs were to expire. In other words, when you put something in of a pandemic and those programs wouldn't be in place if it wasn't for the pandemic, when those programs go away, then you ought to get back to the level of expenditure pre-pandemic plus inflation plus increase in population. But the leadership here in Congress has recklessly accelerated the return to multi-trillion-dollar deficits through legislation and even executive actions. In 2021, despite warnings from President Obama's former economic advisor, Democrats abused the budget reconciliation process to fast-track a $2 trillion liberal wish list that sparked the highest inflation that another partisan reconciliation bill. that they claimed would reduce inflation and cut the deficit, but should be to nobody's surprise and backed up by CBO figures and other increases. And by this administration's own estimate, the bill added another $200 billion to the nation's tab. But at least those bills actually passed Congress. The same can't be said of the administration's $400 billion or more student loan bailout or its unilateral expansion of the food stamp program. In President Biden's vision for the future, public debt dwarfs our nation's entire economic output. Annual deficits under Biden budget grow from $1 4/10 trillion last year to over $2 trillion 10 years from now. By 2027, public debt would surpass record levels set in the wake of World War II and continue to climb. We have a chart that shows that. Like a family or business that incurs more debt simply to make good on past debts, our nation's risk entering a vicious debt spiral as interest rates costs soar. In President Biden's vision of the future, interest on the debt costs more than the national defense. Interest costs nearly triple from $476 billion last year to over $1 3/10 billion at the end of the 10-year budget window, and total a staggering $10 2/10 trillion over 10 years, as you can see in the chart. That's $10 trillion in hard-earned tax dollars that will not go to improving the lives of Americans. With a larger share of our budget tied up in servicing our debt, we'll be less able to respond to future inflations, pandemics, and foreign threats. In President Biden's vision for the future, American debt leaves us more vulnerable and less competitive on the world stage. At home, private business investment is increasingly going to be crowded out, leading to anemic economic growth, lower wages, and fewer jobs. And you get out of this budget situation not by growing taxes, but by growing the economy. We had bank failures this past week. Those bank failures highlighted how fragile our economy is right now, given decades high inflation and rising interest rates. The more Congress borrows and spends, the higher interest rates will have to go up, and ultimately it's families and small businesses that will suffer the economic consequences. President Biden's vision for the future includes $5 trillion in tax hikes on all income levels, including millions on families with incomes under $400,000, regardless of what the president says, limiting it to just people $400,000 and above. Tax revenues are currently at historic highs, yet the president wants to extract. Remember, inflation is a tax. Right on everything you buy. Under his budget, the government's bite out of the economy would be the largest since World War II. And despite all that, he continues adding to our national debt at breakneck speed. Clearly, we aren't going to be able to tax our way out of the current fiscal mess. To climb out of a fiscal hole that we dug, we must stop digging. And this isn't just a Democrat problem of deficit spending. Republicans have been culpable as well. Instead, the president's proposed $2.5 trillion in new mandatory spending programs. Meanwhile, he largely ignores existing major trust fund programs that are on a path to insolvency. To the extent such programs are addressed, his budget relies on smoke and mirrors to kick the can down the road. So President Biden's vision for our future is more taxes, more debt, less opportunity, and fewer resources for essential government services. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are happy with this budget and want to embrace it as their own, then I'd say, fine, let's have a vote on it. And I'd challenge Leader Schumer to bring it to a vote and predict it'd get very few votes. And that's happened to Republican budgets as well. In other words, presidents propose, Congress disposes. Let's actually do it to work. Republicans are ready and willing to work with presidents to get a grip on Washington's out-of-control spending and debt, but working together will require a shared acknowledgement of the serious fiscal problems we're facing and a willingness to work across the aisle. And unfortunately, I don't see any evidence that in this budget. But Senator Biden recognized that when he wanted to freeze the budget across the board, helping me do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Our witness today to speak about President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget is Shalonda Young, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Thank you for being here, Director Young. Please proceed with your opening statement. Your full testimony will be made a matter of the record.
Great. I'll make this quick so we can get to the question and answer portion. But Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on President Biden's fiscal year 24 budget. President Biden came into office with a very clear plan to grow the economy, not from the top down, but from the middle out and the bottom up. Over the past 2 years, in the face of significant challenges, that strategy has produced historic results for the American people. Under the president's leadership, we've added more than 12 million jobs, more jobs in 2 years than any president has created in a single to 3.1, one of the lowest rates in over 50 years. We've taken action to lower prescription drug costs, health insurance premiums, and energy bills while driving the uninsured rate to historic lows. And the president's economic plan in rebuilding America's infrastructure, promoting workers, and fueling a manufacturing boom that is strengthening parts of the country that have long been left behind. The president has done all of this while delivering on his commitment to fiscal responsibility. During his first 2 years in office, the deficit fell $1.7 trillion, the largest decline in American history. And the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars more over the next decade. The president's fiscal year 2024 budget details a blueprint to build on this progress and finish the job. It's built around 4 key values: investing in America, lowering costs for families, protecting and strengthening Medicare and Social Security, and reducing the deficit. And it does all of this while ensuring that no one earning less than $400,000 pays a penny more in taxes. The budget more than fully pays for its investments, cutting deficits by nearly $3 trillion over the next decade by asking the wealthy and large corporations to begin to pay their fair share and cutting wasteful spending to special interests. The budget builds on the progress made over the last 2 years and proposes additional policies to lower costs for working families, including for health insurance, prescription drugs, child care, utilities, housing, college, energy, and more. When working families have a little more breathing room, they can help power our economy forward. The budget protects and strengthens Medicare and Social Security, bedrock programs that America's seniors have paid into their entire working lives. It also invests in America and working families. The budget will bolster manufacturing, make our communities safer, provide paid leave, support research in cancer, deliver for our veterans, cut taxes for families with children, and more. These investments will pay dividends for decades to come. And in what will be a decisive decade for America and the world, this budget reflects the national security strategy by including robust investments in military readiness, our diplomatic and development tools, and honors a sacred commitment to our veterans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear here today and testify on behalf of the President's fiscal year 24 budget.
Thanks, Director Young. It's great to have you here. Last year, OMB estimated that by the latter part of the century, federal spending on crop insurance, coastal disasters, healthcare, and fire suppression would increase by between $26 and $134 billion per year due to climate change. Put in terms of 10-year budget windows, which is the way we put things in this committee, that would result in between $260 billion and $1.3 trillion in additional federal spending, with a middle case estimate of around $700 billion in additional spending. Now, that estimate does not include a variety of other federal programs that would be affected by climate change disasters, including defense spending and infrastructure, and it does not include the effect that we've been hearing about in this committee's hearings of what are called systemic risks, when there's a whole economic meltdown associated with things going wrong. For instance, when property values crash in coastal or wildfire areas because the risk is uninsurable and the properties are therefore unmortgageable, or the widely reported carbon bubble risk. Is it fair to say that OMB's estimate is a lower bound estimate of the budgetary risk of climate change?
I agree with that assessment. Your assessment that the expenditure impacts we have are an undervalue, are underreported here. One thing we have to do a better job here and in the private sector is incorporate what climate damages will mean for our expenditures in the future. I just met with some economists and outside organizations who do economic forecasting, so we can share information and figure out how we accurately build this into our economic forecasts in this country and into our budgets.
Freddie Mac's chief economist has suggested that a coastal property values crash is likely as a result of the sea level rise and storm risk, and that could cascade out into the economy in the same way that the mortgage wreckage of 2008 cascaded across the economy. How would you describe how well the federal budget did as a result of the 2008 mortgage meltdown?
We saw the impact of that meltdown. I think most people would tell you the economic scarring from that took years to recover from. Some say, we still see some of the weaknesses that crisis brought to bear. And it gave us some lessons we learned in responding to the COVID pandemic and the economic outcome of that, which we learned to go big and address those problems head on so we didn't see that scarring. But you're right, when you look at climate change and the potential for that level of crisis, if you compare it to the financial crisis of 2008, it could have sustained economic fallout for the United States and the rest of the global economy.
One of the things that my friend Kent Conrad used to point out when he sat in this chair years ago was that the only times we've successfully balanced the budget over the last 50 years have been when revenues accounted for 19 to 20% of GDP. If we go below that, we go into deficit, and if we are accruing revenues then at that level, then we've got the chance to have a solid budget. Under the president's budget, what share of GDP would revenue account for? And how does that compare to the last time we had a balanced budget during the Clinton administration?
So on average, the president's policies would bring in about 19.6% as a percent of GDP. And that's right in line where policies were, tax revenue was under President Clinton. As you mentioned, the last time we've seen budget surpluses.
And a time when the economy was doing very well.
Yeah, you also saw economic growth. And frankly, the investments we make here today is about growing the economy. We want more people in the workforce. Then you have to look at child care policy in this country. Can women and families enter into the workforce in a meaningful way? Well, most of them will tell you they need adequate child care in which to do that.
Last question. The president's Medicare tax proposal seems like it would both make our tax code fairer and extend Medicare solvency, which looks like a win-win to me. Could you comment on that?
Look, we will have disagreements about tax policy, I'm sure, a lot today, but the president's vision is clear here. There are billionaires, hundreds of millionaires in this country who pay a less effective tax rate than nurses, teachers, and firefighters. Some analysis have shown some billionaires have an effective tax rate of 8%. The president believes that is inherently unfair. He believes that the tax code needs to be changed to make sure that everyone pays their fair share in this country, not just working families. And we have several proposals in which to do that. Medicare, we have several proposals that would extend the Medicare Trust Fund by at least 25 years. The actuaries at CMS have put out a report, so don't take our word for it, that these policies would extend Medicare by one, making sure our net investment income tax, which was always meant to go into the Medicare Trust Fund, is actually going into that fund, making sure that those over 400,000 pay 1.2% more into Medicare, making sure that legal loopholes are closed so that people who are supposed to pay into Medicare actually pay into Medicare. The wealthiest have found loopholes. So those policies will extend the trust fund by at least 25 years.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Grassley, then Senator Murray.
OMB puts out an annual pay-as-you-go act report. This report clearly shows that last year's reconciliation bill added $199 billion in deficits to the budget scorecard OMB is required to maintain. Since the majority party have tried to claim phony tax gap savings from the law's IRS funding last year, but when legally required to produce an accurate cost estimate, even this administration was forced to admit the bill increases deficits, and so I'm asking you to put that report in the record.
Without objection.
Okay. The president and this budget's supporting documents continue to falsely claim that he is a deficit reducer. Nobody believes that. People know about the trillions spent in spending binge last Congress and the costly administrative actions. CBO's current law baseline when compared to February 2021 baseline when President Biden took office shows increased deficits of $6 trillion over 21 to 31, and you can see it here. So it seems to me the administration misleads the American people on real deficit reduction. Your response to that?
Senator Grassley, CBO's job is to show the path on deficits as if no policies happen. The president has policies. His policies would bring down the deficit by $3 trillion. CBO has not looked at the president's policies yet. They will do that later this summer. So CBO gave you a baseline. That assumes none of this happens. And that is why the president is putting these policies forward, because we do believe staying on current course is not sustainable.
You can see from the chart that that the deficit actually goes up, and I'll just leave that where it is. What is the primary driver of our long-term deficit problem?
So deficits, as you know, are year over year. So if you don't want to make the longer-term debt problem worse, you got to deal with yearly deficits. That's why this president's put forward policies that would say over the 10-year period, deficits come down $3 trillion. So as some doctor says, do no more harm. So we have got to get our deficits under control, and that in return has impacts on our debt. But as you know, most of our spending in this country are in entitlements, the aging of our country, and that is typically what makes up at least half of federal expenditures in a year.
So it's you don't include climate change in that list of things that the budget is going up, is that right?
So as I exchanged with the chairman, we have got to do a better job of incorporating climate change into our economic forecast and into our budget. That is a deficit we have.
families in Iowa and across the nation are feeling the pinch of inflation that is caused by the reckless spending that I've already referred to. This administration has repeatedly tried to downplay country's inflation crisis. Why did the administration first budget predict inflation would be in 2021? Let me answer that for you, because I think that it was going to be 2%, but it ended up being 6.7, and then for 2022, 2.9, but the actual inflation was 7.1. So this administration has dramatically missed inflation for 2 years in a row. So why should we believe that you will say inflation is going to be 3% this year?
Senator Grassley, as you know, the Fed has tools that they are using. And what we see is the administration's policies, what the Fed is doing. We are seeing an impact here on inflation. We are clear, inflation is too high. American families are paying too much, and we have to keep our foot on the pedal to bring down costs. What we have seen is a moderation in inflation on a yearly basis. Total CPI is down more than 3%, 3 percentage points from its most recent peak of 9.1% in 2022. So we have to keep our eye on bringing down costs. I'll point out that this budget has lots of policies that bring down healthcare costs, energy costs for families. Those are kitchen table issues that most families tell you they're paying too much for. That's why we put these policies forward.
Senator Murray and then Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, thank you for coming here today and for all the work from you and your staff into delivering this budget. The President often says it, the Chairman said it a minute ago, a budget is a statement of your values. And this budget shows that President Biden's values are with the working people in this country, putting forth a budget that will build a safer, stronger country and ensure America stays competitive for decades to come, even lowering the deficit, all by simply asking billionaires and giant corporations to pay their fair share. There is a lot to like in here. The President's budget understands that tackling the child care crisis, as you just mentioned, is an investment in our workforce and in our economy, and it includes a lot of other important investments, everything from boosting the supply of affordable housing to strengthening Medicare and Social Security for the next generation. And those are the exact kinds of investments that House Republicans are attempting to hold hostage now or cut entirely as Congress looks to address the debt ceiling. The full faith and credit of the United States to pay our bills on time, like every family is expected to, should never be held hostage to score cheap political points. So let me be clear, for the sake of the House Republican colleagues, threatening economic catastrophe to cut Pell Grants is not the political winner you think it is. The President is absolutely right. We need to drop the politics, address the debt ceiling without any strings attached, and soon, just like we have done under administrations of both parties. Director Young, my question for you, can you talk to us about the importance of the level of non-defense discretionary spending proposed in this budget, and how a strong non-defense discretionary top line that does invest in our families and our infrastructure and our workforce directly strengthens our country's ability to compete with China and others on the world stage?
Yeah, I'll add one thing to that as well, Senator, our national security. And what still baffles me is we keep defense on one side and State Department, USAID, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, all on what we call non-defense. So if we have to take drastic cuts to non-defense discretionary, some plans would actually wipe out non-defense discretionary. We would see drastic cuts to the only child care program we really have at the federal level. The child care block grants would be obliterated. So families who use that for child care assistance would be left out in the cold. Low-income heating assistance, which I know many of your communities rely on, also helps with cooling. That would be let go. State Department would be harmed. Our border operations would be harmed. So the list goes on and on. It would be detrimental to see those cuts. Sequestration, for example, we talked a lot about what happened in 2011 and 2012. That was a 5% cut, small in comparison to what some are talking about now. And some agencies, some programs that working families rely on are still trying to build back from those harmful sequester cuts.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm just going to say that now we do have the president's budget. As chair of the Appropriations Committee, we are going to be pressing forward with the work of writing our nation's spending bills as quickly as possible in a bipartisan way. And I'm working very closely with Vice Chair Collins on this. I believe we have a real opportunity and a responsibility to work together to make our country more safe, more competitive, and do some good for the people we represent. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, while it's good to see many Republicans acknowledge the need to build on these key defense investments, I have to say it again, as you just did, investments in non-defense spending are just as critical as investments in defense spending. We have to invest in our workforce to build those semiconductors here in America, just as we invest in military readiness. It's not a question of either or, we need both. So I do hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle take this into consideration as we do move forward on our appropriations bills through regular order. Rest assured, we are going to be very busy in our committee with hearings and markups to get these bills to the floor as soon as possible. And just let me say in my last 20 seconds, Director, thank you for the hand foresight in funding. You know that's important to my state. I'm glad that President Biden heard me loud and clear, and I really appreciate the progress that this budget makes. Thank you.
Senator Johnson, then Senator Stabenow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, welcome. Seeing as this is the Budget Committee, I'd like to separate rhetoric from actual numbers and start using some numbers. We've heard a lot of rhetoric in terms of the wealthy. In your testimony, you said the wealthy, quote, we're going to begin to pay their fair share, unquote. So I think my question for you is, at what point will you consider the wealthy paying their fair share? The most recent analysis I have comes from the Tax Foundation for the tax year 2020, where the top 1% made 22.2% of the income, but paid 42.3% of the income tax. Now, 2019 analysis showed that they made about 21% of income and paid 24% of total federal tax. So again, the top 1% paid about 42.3% income tax and somewhere around 24% of total taxes. What would be a fair percent of total income taxes in your mind for the wealthy to pay?
So I will point out that you talked a lot about federal tax. We have.
I also did total tax with about 24%. So in your mind, again, you have to use metrics here. When will the top 1% pay their fair share? What percent of income taxes, what percent of total taxes will be their fair share?
I'll go back to a statistic that I talked about earlier, where some analysis showed 400 of the wealthiest families in this country pay an 8% effective rate.
So let me start. The top 1% pay an average of 26% top rate. The bottom 50% pay 3.1%. So the bottom 50% pay 3.1%. The top 1% pay an effective rate of 26%. That's a pretty big delta. That's a progressive tax rate. Again, I want to know what should the top 1% pay in terms of total income tax? What should they pay as a percent of total tax? What percent should that be? Right now, it's 42.3% of total income tax. It's around 24% of total tax.
Senator, I'm happy to take a look at the analysis you're looking at. I'm happy to share ours where.
No, I mean, listen, you don't even need to look at it. Right now, it's 42%.
That's your analysis.
Should it be 50%? Should they pay 70% of the total income tax? Should they pay 50% of total tax? I mean, in your mind, to step away from rhetoric, at what point will you be satisfied that the top 1% are paying their fair share? I mean, you ought to be able to figure that off the top of your head.
Yeah, Senator, I've told you, and I'm happy to share this analysis. 400 of the wealthiest families in this country pay 8%.
That's not answering the question.
Okay.
Total tax paid in 2017 before Republican tax reform, $3.3 trillion revenue raised. Last year, 4.897. That's a 47.6% increase in total revenue raised. That's pretty good, don't you think? By the way, corporations paid in 2017 $297 billion. Last year, they paid $425 billion. That's a 43% increase. So again, we're raising a lot more revenue because of economic growth. I would say the tax reform worked in spurring economic growth. So those are just the facts. But in your testimony, you said that this budget, the president's budget, reduced the deficit. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, we ran a deficit of $984 billion, which is still way too much. In 2022, it was $1.37 trillion. In 2023, it's projected to be over $1.5 trillion. The president's budget now is projecting $1.8 trillion. So from 1.3 to 1.5 to 1.8, how can you claim that's reducing the deficit?
Easily, Senator, my entire statement said we talk about 10-year budget windows. Over the 10-year budget window, if you go look at 2033, the president's budget will bring down deficits by $3 trillion, or nearly $3 trillion, 2.9.
But again, year to year. I mean, I think most people say when you're reducing the deficit, you're looking at year on year. So we're going from 1.3 trillion to 1.6 trillion to now 1.8 in the budget. You're actually increasing the deficit by about $300 billion in 2024 is your projection over the 2023 projection. You're increasing the deficit. And by the way, that's a massive deficit, $1.8 trillion. What do you think is sparking inflation, which caused the Fed to start increasing interest rates, which is causing the run on these banks? At what point are you going to acknowledge the harm that this massive deficit spending is causing our economy? You're certainly not recognizing in your 2024 budget.
Senator, what I hope we all realize is that inflation is a global phenomenon. The UK doesn't have the same laws over the last few years that the United States has, and it has inflation. India, the same.
Again, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
Senator, it absolutely has nothing to do with one piece of legislation. Every developed economy in the world is experiencing inflation. What that tells us is there's not one piece of legislation passed by the United States that has an impact.
It was trillions of dollars of deficit spending, trillions of dollars printed, chasing too few goods. That's what caused inflation, and that's what was promoted by this president. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn to Senator Stabenow.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Director Young. Thank you so much for your leadership, for President Biden. So much to respond to, and I want to talk about one important Michigan project. But let me start by just saying for the record that what we know is that of all the deficit ever created in the history of the country, 25% came from 4 years of President Trump. And so we are certainly moving forward to lower that amount. You indicated $1.7 trillion in deficit reduction in the first 2 years. I think it is important to know that in your 10-year budget, you are proposing a $3 trillion reduction in what I've seen from particularly House Republican proposals that are public, that what they want to do, it would increase the deficit by $3 trillion by maintaining the huge Trump tax cuts and really doubling down on making sure that rich people don't have to pay their taxes through IRS audits and so on and so on. I also, just to respond to my colleague about what is the number, what should folks pay? Well, prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, 19 of the top 100 corporations basically paid zero. So I would say we'll start with zero is not okay when small businesses are paying a top rate, when individuals are paying zero is not okay. If you benefit from clean air, clean water, drive on the roads, our healthcare system, our military, et cetera, et cetera. And so now at least we have a floor for those corporations, which I think is only fair for everybody else. And so I'm glad that we're now investing in America and appreciate so much we're bringing jobs home and investing in putting money in the pockets of the middle class and working folks and small businesses, because that is growing the economy, fastest growing economy in the last I don't know, in my lifetime maybe, under first 2 years of a president. And so I appreciate that vision. I also wanted to thank you for the wonderful funding for behavioral health in the budget. And this is a bipartisan priority. We added, as you know, to our gun safety legislation last year, an expansion of certified community behavioral health clinics, and you make that permanent in this budget. And I'm not only smiling, but our former colleague, Senator Roy Blunt, I'm sure is as well, and all of our colleagues who care deeply about mental health and addiction services. So I thank you for that. And the other thing I want to thank you for is understanding that Social Security and Medicare are great American success stories. And we certainly don't want to do what we, again, are hearing from House proposals, raise the age of Social Security to 70 or Medicare to 70, so you have to wait 5 more years to get health care as a senior. But we want to keep those strong, so thank you. I do want to spend my last moment talking about something you and I have talked about, but I want for the record to just really make the case as it relates to a jobs, national security, economic project that runs through Michigan. And that is the SULOCs, up a national project of significance. We have a large Lock 1 that will allow large barges and ships to come down the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the Great Lakes. From there, they're carrying raw materials, they're carrying products, but they go by rail and truck to every part of our country. This is a major infrastructure project. And we know that, simply put, if this one lock, which is the only large functioning lock we have, went down, this would be devastating to our economy. It would harm manufacturing, it would harm agriculture, it would jeopardize our national security. And according to the Army Corps, who we have really have an excellent relationship with, so appreciate their leadership, but a 6-month unscheduled outage at the SULOCs would result in 11 million jobs lost. 6 months, 11 million jobs, $1.1 trillion hit to the economy. And the Department of Homeland Security says it's hard to conceive of a single piece of infrastructure more consequential in terms of its impact on the economy and national security from an unexpected and sustained closure. So we need to get this done. We're in the middle of the project, as you know, and I appreciate their support, but we're on borrowed time to get this done. And so I could go on and on. I will not. I appreciate what has happened to date, but I would just ask you, Director Young, given the stakes on the SULOCs project, is this a priority for you and the administration? Do I have your commitment to do whatever it takes to make sure that we complete the project, and to do that, whatever it takes, to secure the funding for the SULOCs, not only this year, but through completion?
Well, let me be clear, this budget holds $235 million for this project. That is not a small amount. That should hopefully show you our commitment. The federal government understands the importance of this project, and you have our commitment to remain partners and get this job finished.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to my friends across the aisle today and the rationale behind the president's budget proposal, I'm fearful the White House is using the same voodoo accounting that brought down SVC Bank. You know, I'm often asked what's the greatest threat our nation faces, and I'm here to tell you it's not Russia, it's not China, it's not North Korea, it's not Iran. And though I love the environment, it's not climate change. The greatest long-term threat the United States faces is our national debt. At $31 trillion and growing, paying almost $500 billion in interest last year alone, this national debt is unsustainable. For 2 years, Democrat one-party rules controlled Washington, D.C., and ran up the tab, maxed out the nation's credit cards on the backs of hardworking Americans. In the first 20 months of office, President Biden has spent more than any other president in United States history. This reckless spending agenda has added another $3.7 trillion to the debt, a 13% increase and cost hardworking families in the wave of 40-year high skyrocketing inflation, which we all know is a tax on hardworking Americans. Under this administration, energy prices have risen more than 37%, home heating fuel more than 52%, electricity prices more than 23%, gasoline more than 45%, grocery more than 19%. All the while, real wages aren't keeping up with inflation. To the Biden administration, these added costs are just a number. But to families I meet in rural America, it's their hard-earned wages that now get nearly 20% less groceries for their families than they did just 2 years ago. And now the White House gives this committee a new budget that will almost double the annual interest and soon push our annual deficit towards $2 trillion a year. And if that's not enough, they promise $4.7 trillion in new taxes, including raising corporate taxes that, as we all know, are going to be passed down to consumers, further fanning inflation. This budget issue and how we handle it will be the defining action of this committee and the 118th Congress. Let me tell you what this reminds me of. This is the equivalent of a young adult who's maxed out their own personal credit card, and now, instead of cutting expenses, ask their parents for another credit card. I ask you, what parent would comply with this ill-fated request? Folks, we have to use this debt ceiling issue to pry the nation's maxed-out credit card from Joe Biden's hands. He must come to the negotiating table and work towards balancing the budget. If not, he must be held responsible for the dramatic increase in spending over the past 2 years, and blowing through the debt ceiling. He and he alone will bear this responsibility. Listen, this committee needs to take back the nation's credit card and restore the purchasing power back to the American people. I will not support any budget that does not work to responsibly balance. If the president would negotiate in good faith, this would be a different story. There's historical precedent for coupling spending reductions with increasing the debt limit. For the sake of my children and grandchildren, I will hold the line. The president will not get permission from me to increase the debt limit without real substantive cuts to our spending. I hope the members of this committee will join me. Director Young, does this administration have any intention of negotiating in good faith with Republicans to stop this reckless spending and get back to balancing the budget? Yes or no?
Senator, I've been here, this is my 3rd year on the budget. There's a budget process, there's an appropriations process. We work together every year to fund the government and talk about spending priorities.
So my question is,
and we are happy to do that again this
so
year.
yes or no, will this president work in good faith towards negotiating a budget that gets back to a balanced budget?
As he has done in December, he will work on a bipartisan basis to talk about what the appropriate spending levels are.
That doesn't sound very optimistic to me. How do you intend to do that when you know our goals? And you bring us a budget that's a month late and has the highest sustained levels of taxes, spending, and deficits in American history.
Senator, let me be clear. The president is not going to support cutting programs that are essential to working families in this country. What he believes is correct is ask those at the top of the ladder to pay more so we can invest in those working families you talked about. I'm from a small town, less than 2,000. What they tell me is they want infrastructure. They want the government to work for them. This budget does that by asking billionaires who don't exist in Clinton, Louisiana, and places like it to pay what they pay when they go to work as an effective tax rate.
Last quick question.
Budget.
Whose idea was it to cut $600 million from the Department of Homeland Security when there's a raging crisis at the nation's southern border?
I'm happy to give you a sheet of paper that shows the DHS budget is increased by 9%. That is not correct. There is a fee issue on passenger fees where it is literally a budget scoring issue where DHS will keep passenger fees rather than give them back to the Treasury. In actual dollars, in budget authority, the Department of Homeland Security goes up by 9%, including a $4.7 billion contingency fund that would fund our operations at the southwest border.
This is the
which we
funky
hope-
voodoo accounting I'm talking about that gets this nation in trouble, that brings down banks as well. But we look forward to working with your office. We'll show you our numbers, we'll show you the budget shown to us, and we'll look at yours as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member for this important hearing, and to Director Young, thank you for the work that you and your team put in day after day, and to have your expertise here. I certainly appreciate it, and I also appreciate getting a chance to visit with you yesterday. Now, one of the areas that we chatted about is in the area of behavioral health, and I agree with our chair, with Chair Stabenow, about the importance of the investment that came in mental and behavioral health. $387 million, which would help train about 18,000 behavioral health providers to help respond to the mental and substance challenges that we face across the country. The one area that I'm hoping that we can still work together and that we can work together as colleagues is in the area of retention. What I've heard from providers across New Mexico and in different parts of America is the concern of a reality where we're losing a lot of folks. And that tells me that we could be doing more for retention. So is that an area that we could work together to ensure that we're able to retain what we have while we're still making a significant investment to train those that we need?
You absolutely have my commitment to do that. We saw during COVID the burnout for people who worked in those jobs and nursing jobs. And we have got to do something or we're going to have a long-term shortage issue in behavioral health. So as we hopefully work together in a bipartisan manner to increase resources here, we don't have the personnel to do the work. The resources are going to be for naught. So you have my commitment to work on that together.
I appreciate that, Director, and I certainly hope that, again, in a bipartisan way, you'll see action by the Senate and by the legislative branch of government to work together for the good of the country. Now, turning to broadband, I have the honor of chairing a subcommittee in the Commerce Committee that has a jurisdiction over many of these areas. And what we have seen recently is through a bipartisan effort, the creation of the Affordable Connectivity Program, and authorized the Federal Communications Commission to provide $30 a month for families at 200% of poverty and $75 a month on tribal lands. As we've heard from many in a bipartisan way, the importance of this program towards affordability when it comes to broadband across America, Congress appropriated $14 billion, which is a lot of money, for this effort to help households to afford the broadband they need for work, school, and health care. 16.6 million households currently participate in this program. That's 43 million Americans. Unfortunately, the Affordable Connectivity Program is expected to run out of money in 2024. Some studies showed by June, some are suggesting by the end of the first quarter. Director Young, yes or no, does the president support funding this critical program?
Yes, and we thank you for the resources provided in the infrastructure law for this.
I appreciate that. Why was there not additional support in the budget for the Affordable Connectivity Fund?
As you pointed out, thanks to the infrastructure law, $42 billion was invested in NTIA's program. The planning grant has been awarded. The future awards to states and localities will be announced soon. So there is a belief that there is money about to hit the ground that will make a historic difference. And before that money is spent, there's some view that it would be premature to add additional, since those grants to state and locals had not happened yet.
And Mr. Chairman, the reason I asked that question is I think it's important for all of us to bring more attention to this particular program, which was supported broadly, Democrats and Republicans. Former FCC Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, a conservative voice, has talked about a conservative approach to this particular program. My concern is that the internet service providers and others that are responsible for this program, they have to start planning a few months in advance. If in fact the projections show that this program is going to run out in the first quarter of 2024, that means at the end of this year, there's not going to be any more. And that's a concern that I have. I certainly hope that we can look at all the ideas that are out there that allow us to ensure that this program will in fact eliminate the digital divide. I mean, that was the point of the investment that we worked on together. And I would just point to a quote from the Urban League where their observation was if Congress fails to reauthorize ACP, the federal government likely will end up overpaying for broadband deployments. As a result, the federal dollars will end up funding deployments to significantly fewer unserved and underserved homes and businesses. So I certainly look forward to working with the committee in this space and with our colleagues across the board, and hope that this is something we can tackle together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. Senator Scott, and then Senator Van Hollen.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. Director Young, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I think you have an impossible job. I can't imagine trying to defend a $6.8 trillion budget. I mean, if you look at what this president has done, and you have to come here and defend it, the biggest budget in the history of the country, unbelievable increase, massive inflation, massive deficits, no plan to balance a budget. I mean, not even close to a plan to balance a budget, debt that continues to go up, wages not staying up with inflation, low labor participation. So I think you have an impossible task. I sent you a letter, just to make sure you had some of the questions I was going to ask. So let me just go through some of those. Do you believe that excessive government spending, especially deficit spending, causes inflation?
As I talked to some of your colleagues earlier, I believe inflation, we see it as a global.
No. My question is real simple. Do you believe excessive government spending, running big deficits, causes inflation?
I believe one thing does not cause inflation, and
So,
what we
okay,
see
so
is
you say- so
inflation
that's
is
no.
pervasive around the globe.
That's fine. I mean, no's an answer. So that's no. The federal debt has risen to more than $31 trillion. Since Biden took office, it's almost up $4 trillion. Do you believe that his budget reduces debt, the debt of the country?
Senator One, I use 24.7 trillion. That is publicly held debt. The rest of the debt that you cite is other government trust
You
funds.
think his budget reduces debt?
Our budget focuses on the deficit, which
So
in
it doesn't
turn
reduce
has
debt.
an impact on the
Okay,
debt.
so that's a no. Okay, that's fine. So is President Biden's budget balanced? Meaning, are we going to spend more than we collect?
Senator, no, because we believe that would hurt working families.
Okay, what are you paying right now for interest? What interest rate, and what's the duration of the debt?
The duration of the debt, as you know, depends on Treasury policy on what they do in the bond market.
But what's your
But
budget?
right now, it's about a little over 5 years, the maturity of the debt.
And what's the interest rate that you're paying?
The
In the
interest,
budget?
yeah, the interest rate is close to 3% on the budget, on the debt.
So, and do you believe do you believe in your budget, are you assuming interest rates are going to come down then?
We do show what we believe are accurate forecasts where interest will rise and then level off. Of course, interest rates are rising now as the Fed deals with inflation.
And what will the federal government have, under your budget, what will the federal government have to pay in interest expense next year?
Over 600 billion, 661 billion.
So as a percentage of the budget, do you know what that is?
I'm happy to not do math here, but give that to you for the record.
So since 2019, so pre-COVID, last budget pre-COVID, how much has the U.S. population gone up, do you think? You have any idea? I'll give you.
We
I
talked to
didn't
your,
ask it.
but
It was not my
yes,
letter, so you.
6 million people.
6 million people. So as a percentage, how much is that, you think? It's less than 2%, 1.8%.
So the question, is like, what do we spend per person?
Yeah, so here, let me ask it this way.
Yeah.
So the population since 2019 has gone up 1.8%. How much do you think your proposed budget has gone up from the 2019 budget?
So one way we look at it is that spending is down roughly 5 percentage points of GDP since the president took office.
So it's up, so here's the numbers. So the population in the last 5 years has gone up 1.8%, and your budget would take the budget up 55%. Now explain why, and that's $400,000 per new American. So why would we only have a 6 million increase in the number of Americans since 2019, but had a 55% increase in our budget? How could anybody explain that?
Senator, I'll take your information as fact, but the way we look at a lot of these budget measures are percent of GDP. We think that is the way to determine health. And I stated federal spending has gone down as a percentage of GDP since the president took office.
Well, there's COVID. But let's go back to pre-COVID. That's not even close to being true if you go back to 2019. So the GDP has not gone up 55%. I mean, so you come in, and Biden came in the middle of a COVID crisis. So of course there was extra COVID spending. But I mean, think about it. Let's go back. Population's only up 1.8% and your budget's up 55%. That's staggering.
So I know people don't want to give the president for presiding over a $1.7 trillion budget deficit reduction, but he did. And that did not happen by accident. Had he not gotten the pandemic under control, had a vastly successful vaccine program, I'm not sure pandemic spending would have ended because we would have still been dealing with the scarring of the pandemic and the economic fallout from it. So because he did that, I believe we're in a better place economically.
55%.
Senator Van Hollen, and then Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Director. It's great to see you. I would point out that the Inflation Reduction Act that we passed reduced the deficit by $200 billion. It also did something else very important, which was to cut the cost of prescription drugs to seniors on Medicare, including capping the cost of insulin for Medicare recipients at $35 a month, and putting in place other changes that will reduce costs to seniors on Medicare. I applaud you and the President for going even further in this budget in terms of saving costs for seniors on Medicare when it comes to prescription drugs. As I see it, you're talking about $200 billion in savings, which not only saves the taxpayer and helps shore up the Medicare program as part of your strategy to keep it solvent for 25 years, but it will also bring down the costs of drugs to seniors. Is that not right?
That is correct. And Senator, one thing we have not talked anything about is outside of the Medicare population, this president's put in for the proposal to cap insulin prices for all Americans who have private insurance at $35 a month.
Yes, and that's something that I certainly strongly support. As you know, we had a vote on that in the Senate. Unfortunately, in the past Congress, unfortunately, we were not successful at getting that passed. I hope that we will be successful in the coming years. A lot of talk about the deficit on debt, and appropriately so, but this budget will reduce the deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years. We're all looking forward to seeing alternatives that are put out there. I know the House Freedom Caucus is talking about various proposals. We're all eager to see what they would do in terms of their budget proposals. The House Republicans really need to put something on the table. But let me just say, with respect to the deficit and debt, I also applaud the President and the Biden administration for looking at the issue of how we tax work unfairly relative to wealth. And the President has a number of proposals in here to help change that equation so that working people don't face higher tax rates than people who make money off of money. If you look at the long-term impact of the President's revenue changes in this budget, as I look at it, in addition to the $3 trillion deficit reduction over the first 10 years, the projection is $7 trillion in deficit reduction in the second decade. And while the debt as a share of GDP will rise because of the baby boomers and more people benefiting from Medicare and Social Security, under this budget, it is you stabilize the debt to GDP ratio in 2042. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Senator. Look, there's a choice here. We can zero out programs that communities depend on in the name of fiscal responsibility. But if you keep tax cuts for the wealthy, you actually do not save any money for the deficit. Or we can continue to invest in the middle class through things like childcare, paid leave, those policies that bring people into the workforce, while asking those at the very top, the very, very top, to begin paying something that looks closer to what people who go to work every day pay as far as the tax rate goes. What that does is, as you pointed out, bring down the deficit over 10 years by nearly $3 trillion. And when you deal with deficits and bring down the deficits, it makes sure that our debt problem does not get worse. As you pointed out, we do have a population that's getting older, but what we can do is make sure our deficits are under control. And we're happy to enter into conversation with anyone who wants to talk about that. But this president is very clear. He believes the economy grows when you focus on those in the middle and working families. And when you look at how those at the very top borrow against money they never pay taxes on, and have incomes that are never taxed, he believes that's unfair. And this budget does something about it and puts us on a stronger fiscal path.
I agree, and I think it's been pointed out here that if you look at the total accumulated United States debt, a quarter of that was accumulated during just the 4 years of the Trump administration. And the debt ceiling was raised 3 times during that period. So I really hope going forward, as we work through the budget process and look at the House's proposal and look at the President's proposal and deal with the budget issues, that people will not take our economy off a cliff by threatening not to pay our bills on time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Romney's up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's helpful, if we're going to be responsible as we consider discussions about our spending and the budget, if we put COVID funding aside, because I think it's embarrassing to suggest the President has reduced the size of the deficit or reduced spending as a percentage of GDP. When we had COVID, we were in the midst of COVID, we passed extraordinary measures. The President, went far beyond Congress with a $1.9 trillion plan. To say somehow that he's been cutting the deficit is just not realistic. And Senator Scott described the change in actual federal funding on a baseline basis. I think if you're serious about discussing the budget and what's going on, what our needs are, putting COVID funding aside is essential for that conversation. On a separate topic, I'm not aware of anyone in this category, but are you aware of anyone of the elected officials we have in the federal government, at the Congress, or anywhere else that have proposed cutting or have currently proposed cutting benefits for Social Security of any kind?
Senator, I have heard of proposals.
No. You've heard of proposals from a current senator, currently or congressman, currently proposing to cut benefits to Social Security?
Yes. Have they changed their position?
No,
Maybe.
no,
But yes. Members who are current members.
I said, has anyone in the last several months or the last year, has anyone, Republican or Democrat, proposed Social Security benefits?
So now you're asking if people change their position? Maybe. But there are records.
Are you aware of anyone?
There is a record.
Are you aware of
current members
anyone?
Congress
Excuse me. Are
have
you aware of
policies.
anyone? Are you aware of anyone proposing cutting Social Security benefits?
Your first question, current members have well-known policies out there to cut Social Security and Medicare.
That's simply wrong. That is simply wrong, and it's not honest to say that to members of Congress. That is simply wrong. There is no one who's recommending cutting Social Security benefits, all right? Number one. Number two, do you recognize that in the next 10 years or so, the trust fund on Social Security is going to run out, and under the law, benefits would be cut dramatically, like 25%. You're aware of that?
I'm aware.
Yeah. That's a problem, right?
Of course.
Well, why is it then that in the president's budget there's no effort to address that whatsoever?
And while we clearly disagree on this, there are some who have policies on websites. I'm happy to print them and send them to the committee. Whether they have changed their position is another thing. who want to cut have policies.
I'm sorry,
enhanced
that was
Social
not the
Security.
question. The question was.
So this
I'm
president.
sorry, you've got to answer the questions.
So
As opposed
this
to change the
president
topic.
has put forth
I asked the
a budget on
question, why
Social
did the
Security
president,
that
why
would
does the
protect
president's
Social Security
budget
from being
not
cut.
lay out how you would
This
protect Social
president
Security?
believes the existential threat to Social Security are those who want to cut it. His budget says no.
There's nobody in this committee that wants to cut it. I know of no Republican or Democrat in the House or the Senate who is proposing cutting Social Security benefits. And it's dishonest to keep saying it. It's offensive and dishonest and not realistic. We have a problem in Social Security. We need to address it. You agree we have a problem in Social Security. Make it clear, 1,000%. No Republican is proposing cutting Social Security benefits. Now, the question is, why have you not proposed in your budget any action to protect Social Security?
Senator, I look forward to seeing plans that are very,
different question.
clear
The
in black
question
and
is,
white.
why
This
have you not
president has
proposed
put
it?
that those
Why have you
that
not
they
made
will
a
not
proposal?
cut Social Security. This president has put it in black and white. We look forward to seeing a plan that suggests that Social Security is off the table. This president believes the biggest threat to Social Security are those who want to cut it. His budget says no.
You know, I really do find that just offensive in the extreme, which is you can't name anyone who is proposing Social Security benefits. I have said, and I know my colleagues, no one is proposing cutting Social Security benefits for our Social Security recipients. No one is proposing that on our side. And you keep on saying that's the biggest threat. The biggest threat is in 10 years or so, the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money and benefits get automatically cut by 25%. We don't want that to happen. I'm upset that the president hasn't included any effort to address that shortfall because I want to protect Social Security benefits for all of our recipients. Now, a question I have is, you do, fortunately, look at Medicare and suggest, hey, we need to take action to protect Medicare. I agree with that. I'm glad you do. You propose, however, the only solution is not cutting costs at all, but only raising taxes. Do you believe there's any prospect that Republicans are going to vote to raise taxes only as a way to save Medicare?
For those over 400,000, I hope so, that they would raise those
No, I
taxes
said,
by
do
1.2%.
you believe that Republicans in the House and in the Senate are going to vote to raise taxes and nothing else, just raise taxes to save Medicare?
Well, that is not the only proposal. If you look, the net investment income tax, which was always created to go into the Medicare Trust Fund and was not, we suggest moving that over as a part of keeping Medicare extended by at least 25 years. So that's one part of the proposal. That is not a raising of tax. That
Do you
is
believe,
accounting
I know
for-
my time is up, do you believe that it makes sense for a bipartisan effort to work together to find compromise positions, common ground, to actually save Social Security and protect Medicare?
Yes.
Thank you.
Senator Kane is up now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Young. You highlighted the job gains that we've seen under President Biden. That's been remarkable with an unemployment rate as low as it's been in many decades. But the flip side is that I'm hearing from an awful lot of employers who are having a hard time hiring people. A low unemployment rate is good, but it does create labor market challenges. At the same time, I'm hearing from people all across Virginia who want to work, who have great skills, want to be in the workforce, but what's holding them up is the lack of high-quality, affordable childcare. I think you mentioned this in one of your interchanges with either Senator Whitehouse or Senator Murray. How will President Biden's budget continue progress in dealing with this issue by funding childcare that will be good for kids and parents, but also be good for the productivity of our nation's economy?
Yeah, it matters what you invest in. And we believe we have to grow the economy. And one of the important pieces of the president's investments is childcare. You've always funded, or for the foreseeable past, funded childcare block grants. I think everyone here would suggest that's not enough. But this budget does, because it's our one existing program on the federal level at $1 billion, building on the 30% increase Congress provided to that program on a bipartisan basis. So we thank you for that. We also go further, and we would establish a mandatory program that would, frankly, be a game changer for parents across this country. And the president believes that, along with our pre-K proposals, universal pre-K4, and for those high performers, pre-K3, between those child care proposals and pre-K proposals, families, especially women who we saw drop out of the workforce during COVID, can re-enter, and we can grow our labor pool and get more people into these jobs.
Thank you for that answer, and I look forward to supporting more child care investments. Virginia is home of an awful lot of federal employees. They've been doing important work, maybe particularly the last few years as the constituent needs and demands escalated during COVID. Their wages and salaries haven't been keeping up with the cost of living. Talk to me about what the Biden budget does with respect to pay raise for both civilian federal workers and our service members.
So one, parity is very important to us. For the last 3 budgets, we have put forth a proposal to provide civilians and military. Many times in DOD, civilian and military personnel sitting next to each other towards the same mission. It's only right that both receive the same pay increase, the same COLA. We also took the recommendation of the ECI. The pay raise of 5.2% was built based on economic factors. And it was right to follow that recommendation on an equal basis with the military and with civilians, many of them who worked diligently during COVID, after COVID, and for the American people. And so we followed the recommendations of that economic index because it was the right thing to do, and our federal workers really have overperformed during this difficult time where the federal government really had to respond to make sure our economy and our people got through this pandemic.
Here's a question on a topic that is completely bipartisan, not only in this body but everywhere in this country. It's a desire to reduce deaths by fentanyl and the desire to invest in strategies that will reduce fentanyl being brought into the United States. Most fentanyl that comes in comes across the southern border. It doesn't come in people's backpacks. It comes through ports of entry. Cartels know that they can load trucks up with fentanyl. We only have technology to inspect every few trucks, and they'll run the lottery risk of getting caught every once in a while if they can get fentanyl through our ports of entry. What does the Biden budget do to address strategies for interdicting more fentanyl at our ports of entry?
So one, I've seen it. I've gone to land ports of entry. You see the car doors popped off and packed full of narcotics, a lot of it fentanyl. It's coming, as you pointed out, through our ports of entry. So we have got to have resources at our ports of entry to make sure we have the equipment in place. The infrastructure law I've mentioned a lot today started us down that path of real true investments in our land ports of entry. And we're going to build on that. This budget would have over $500 million for border technology that will also help with technology that would look for fentanyl. Additionally, $40 million for ICE to combat fentanyl trafficking and disrupt transnational criminal organizations to get at the root of the problem, and $9 million to expand DEA's operations there. So we've got to keep a forward foot and deal with this problem before it gets across the border.
Thank you, Director Young. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start off with just some statistics that are astounding to me, and also acknowledge that this migration into heavy debt through the federal government has been going on for a while, and I think it spans administrations. 2000, we were roughly $5 trillion in debt. We put a couple wars on the credit card. By 2008, we were on $10 trillion in debt. 08 to 16, the Obama administration, we went from 10 trillion to 16 trillion. 2 years later, I get to the U.S. Senate. We've now structuralized trillion-dollar deficits annually, therefore 18 trillion in debt. In a little over 4 years, we've gone from 18 trillion in debt to 31 trillion in debt. And then a blueprint for success in this country puts us $51 trillion in debt by 2033. I don't know how that can be sold to the American public as a sustainable, healthy business plan. We had a conversation yesterday evening that you're assuming all of a sudden we can raise 19 to 20% in revenues, when historically, over 50 years, it's been 17.5%. And yes, you did cite for a few years back in the Clinton administration, we did raise close to that. But you're assuming that we can do that going further. I almost had the CBO recalculate how that last tax cut and Jobs Act was playing into the economy, and that was chump change compared to what we're doing now. Remember, that was a $1.5 trillion giveaway to the rich. Pre-COVID, it was actually paying for itself. Sooner or later, if you're going to try to raise revenues when it's above historical levels, it always comes with the price of lower economic activity. And how do you justify that we're then, as far out as you're going to see, spending money in the neighborhood of 24 to 25% of our GDP? This puts us into such lofty territory. The only country in recent history that's ever been there is Japan. We now distinguish ourselves as being the most indebted country of any in the world that's got a developed economy other than that of Japan. So I know in the real world things have got to be sustainable. I also know that politically everyone thinks you can do things differently here. I acknowledge that it's been on both sides of the aisle to date. I got a question in where I think you can probably save some money. I'd love to hear if there's any interest from your point of view. We got a broken healthcare system. It's way too high a percentage of our GDP. 18, 19%, most other places that deliver similar results would be in that 11 to 12% range. Is the administration going to give any thought to trying to fix healthcare by making it more transparent, more competitive? You got doctors now that are questioning whether they want to even invest the time and effort employed by larger and larger corporations. What about tackling the one thing that would actually make it cheaper for how you pay for health care through Medicare or Medicaid or the private sector? Are you interested in reforming that biggest sector of our economy?
Absolutely, Senator. You see some of our proposals here, prescription drugs, for example, that not only saves money for seniors when we allow Medicare to negotiate, it actually saves the government about $160 billion to have more drugs in negotiation and to bring those negotiations forward. That's one of the proposals in this budget. But I don't think anyone would argue with you that the United States pays more as a percentage of health care than most other large economies in this.
So you're going to try to use government to price control there, and sometimes when you operate your business like an unregulated utility, that's going to happen. And I think the healthcare industry is asking for that. What about pushing things like transparency, competition? There was an executive order from the Trump administration asking hospitals to be forthright on transparency and pricing. Are you trying to enforce that? That's already out there. To me, it seems like there's a lot of stuff that you could do other than using government to force it by trying to fix the healthcare industry from the bottom up. Before I run out of time, it looks like you're at least interested in maybe considering that. Are you interested in what we're doing generally, regardless of who's enterprising here politically, whether it's Democrats or Republicans? We certainly have embraced the idea that we want to borrow from our kids and grandkids. And you can do things like saying, real interest rates are kind of being looked at, the nominal interest rates that we're paying, and part of the kind of debt and inflation bomb that was unleashed over the last 2-3 years, some of what we did bipartisan in trying to go after the CARES Act, that is going to come home to roost, and it is right now in our own banking system that's starting to show strain, because you cannot inflate the economy. You're going to sooner or later find these weaknesses, and we're going through it. And it does boil down to the simple question: do we want to run this enterprise unlike any other place in this country? Do you think it makes sense to borrow money from our kids and grandkids for the latest and greatest idea that comes out of this place? That seems to be what you're doing here.
Just give me a simple answer to that. Is it worth, it'd be like asking your kids at Thanksgiving, want to put an addition on their house, I want to take a vacation, and I want you to pay for it.
Senator, the president's budget's clear. He's going to ask the wealthiest, top 1%, large corporations, to begin to pay their fair share in order that we can continue to invest in the American people.
Well, good luck with it, because it's never generated more than a 17.5% percentage on tax revenues as a percentage of our GDP over 50 years. Therefore, I think you're being dishonest with the American public. Thank you.
Senator Merkley is up next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for your presentation. A group of colleagues in the House, the Freedom Caucus, they proposed a 30% sales tax as a way to address revenue issues, which would be about a $100,000 tax on a family buying a house, and about a $10,000 tax on a family buying a car. The president did not choose to put this into his budget. Why not?
Senator, I'll go back to what I just told Senator Braun. This president believes, and it is a core value, we can be fiscally responsible, and he's put forward proposals to do that. It will not be on the backs of middle class and working families in this country. We need to ask those at the very top to begin to pay what nurses, teachers, and firefighters pay in this country as a effective tax rate.
Oh, well, thank you, because the idea that we're going to cut taxes on the rich, which is what the Republican plan in the House is, and put this massive additional tax on the ordinary families, I know it would not sell in my state one moment. I do a town hall in every county. Many of them are purebred counties. And the idea you're going to tax a family $100,000 in a house and $10,000 on a car, then not a single person in the room would stand up for that proposal. So I appreciate the president not taking that tact and instead saying fair share. By the way, I did read the analysis behind the richest 400 families paying about an 8% effective tax. It's very sound analysis. It notes that capital gains are basically go untaxed, unrealized capital gains, and that the tax rate for dividends and realized capital gains are much lower than the regular tax rate. And I for one, think that the richest 400 families should pay at least what a middle-class American pays rather than 8%. And that's what the president's budget seems to be saying.
It absolutely is. The billionaire minimum tax, for example, states that those billionaires, hundreds of millionaires, should pay a minimum tax of 25%. We think that that is a fair way to have a tax system in this country where middle class and working families have paychecks, they get taxed. The ways you cited of getting around that, those same people often use that wealth that they never get taxed on to go out and borrow for homes, yachts, and if it's real enough to go out and secure loans, it's real enough to be taxed.
Well, let's talk about homes and housing for middle-class Americans and low-income Americans, because it is the biggest issue coming up in my town halls. Can you talk about how the president's budget addresses the affordability of housing for ordinary Americans?
Absolutely. We've got to do something about housing supply. We often, as a government, have solutions to demand. We have voucher programs that have been hugely successful, still important in some areas that have supply. Not every area in this country is the same, so vouchers are still necessary. But we are proposing, like we did last year, tax credits that would go to developers who build affordable housing in this country. Also recognize that zoning laws are often an impediment to building. We have resources that would go to help streamline zoning laws. I think in some areas of the country, housing is already at crisis levels when it comes to supply, which impacts, as you know, the affordability of that housing when you have too few.
Well, thank you, because that is a huge issue, and we need to invest a lot more. And I see even the dream of home ownership fading away for so many families in my blue-collar community. And I see that the rising rents are driving folks to be paying sometimes more than 50% of their income in a way that was not the case before. I want to turn to the debt issue. The debt is like paying our national credit card. We pass the spending bills, we pass the revenue bills, and the result is a deficit. And then when the debt ceiling is related to whether or not we pay that bill. I'm concerned that a failure to pay our credit card bill, if you will, is going to create a crisis. At a modest level, it might raise the interest rates, devalue our credit rating. It could crash the stock market. Isn't it possible that the strategy of creating a debt crisis is going to raise interest rates that will affect adjustable rate mortgages, the cost of borrowing for a car, perhaps the cost of borrowing for a college for ordinary families in America?
I'll just say we should study 2011. We did not default. But even getting close to default lowered our credit rating, which meant we paid more. The American citizens paid more for goods.
So direct harm on ordinary families.
Absolutely.
I have one more question if I have opportunity to do it, or otherwise I'm out of time. I'm out of time.
Senator Kennedy is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, and I'm going to call you Madam
You
Secretary.
gave me a promotion. Thank you so much.
No, I didn't. I'm intentionally calling you Madam Secretary because you have cabinet level status. And you're also from Louisiana, which I'm very proud of. So we claim you as our secretary. Does it embarrass you? And I know it must because it embarrasses me. This is not a loaded question. That the federal government continues, as we have for a while, to send money to dead people. And they cash the checks.
You and I have talked about this a couple of years ago, and of course, we should not, that should not be happening.
Well, here's what I'm hoping that the administration will take a look at. During the stimulus period, when we were trying to keep our society on its feet, we sent out checks to we sent out $1.4 billion worth of checks to dead people. And they were cashed, obviously fraud. And as best I can tell, we don't know for sure, but we send out between $1 and $2 billion of checks a year continuously to dead people. And they're cashed, obviously fraud. We passed a bill that said Social Security, which gets the information about who's alive and who's dead from the states, has got to talk to the Department of Treasury to make sure that its do not pay list includes people who are dead. It was a shame we had to pass a bill to implement common sense, but nonetheless we did it. But in order to get the bill passed, I had to make some compromises. I can't imagine anybody would be against it. We're going to start doing that on December 23rd of this year, but it's only for 3 years. And the Government Accounting Office says we ought to make it permanent. And I'm going to try to make it permanent. And I really wish, I'm not going to ask you today because I know you have to talk to the president, but if you could talk to the president and try to get a commitment to let's pass it.
I will. One of the things that was shocking to me is Treasury in the last administration and this list from Social Security had to develop an MOU to even share this database. And you would think it would be easy to do that. So I support you. I'd also ask you to work with us. We have a fraud proposal in the budget.
Happy to.
That make sure IGs have what they need. Make sure we go after fraud in the UI system, where we saw transnational crime syndicates, frankly, take advantage of the system. So I'd love to work with you on that as well.
Yeah. Another area I'm hoping the administration will look at, we're spending a lot of money to send pharmaceutical drugs to certain hospitals at really, really low prices. The idea being, of course, that those hospitals will pass that savings on to people who are less fortunate economically than you and me. Mm-hmm. There's just one problem. There's no requirement that the hospitals do that. And some of those hospitals I think it's called the 340B program. Some of those hospitals are going, thank you very much, federal government, for giving me these cheap drugs, and they're turning around because dollars are fungible and basically selling those drugs for a profit to paying patients. And we're spending billions on this. It makes no sense, Madam Secretary. I really wish y'all would take a look at that.
Happy to. We just had a long discussion about healthcare costs, and I'm happy to work with you and your office on this and bring in HHS and CMS to the conversation.
Okay. My last question, I noticed, I listened to one of the president's press conferences, and he said, you know, nobody, no middle income people are going to have to pay any of this $4.7 trillion worth of new taxes. Is that really accurate? I mean, isn't the administration proposing in its budget to roll back some of the provisions, many of the provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
No, sir.
So you're not arguing that we should roll them back?
We are very clearly in the budget state that the president would support extending those tax cuts for those making under $400,000. Now, he does believe we should pay for those.
But he's proposing to roll back tax cuts for people who are making less than $400,000, isn't he?
No, sir.
I think
he's saying the Trump tax cuts, as we call them, expire in 2025. So the 24 budget does not
Some of them
bake in.
expire sooner.
Some of them expire sooner, like the R&D tax credit. And I know there are various proposals in the Senate to extend those. But on individual taxes, the president in black and white says he would support extending those. He would not support raising taxes on anyone under $400,000, but he thinks those over $400,000, ensuring that those are rolled back to pay for lower income, those under $400,000 should be on the table, so we can do that in a fiscally responsible way.
I agree that's what he said. I just don't think that's what his budget does. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Come visit us in Louisiana. Come back to
I'm always there.
Get out of D.C., come back to America.
Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, yeah, South Carolina, come visit us too. Do you believe we should be voting on the president's budget? Would you like to see the Senate take a vote on the president's budget?
Senator Graham, you know I used to work here for a long time, and you know what I'm probably going to say. Budgets are congressional processes, and it would not be appropriate for me as an administration official to weigh in on what comes on the Senate floor.
I think it'd be a good idea to vote on this budget and take the House Freedom Caucus budget. Let's vote on a bunch of these things, and we'll find out what we're against, and eventually we're going to have to find out what we're for. Do you support the idea that entitlements need structural reform to maintain their solvency over time?
Senator, I'm sure you know we have a proposal in to extend Medicare by 25 years. I heard some not excitement about some of the proposals in there, but the president stands behind those proposals that would extend.
Yeah, are you familiar with Senator Cassidy's efforts to reform Social Security?
Don't ask me to go too deep, but you know he is also my home state senator, so I am aware he has some proposals and are working with senators across the aisle.
But we may have different approaches, but you agree with the concept Congress needs to come together in a bipartisan fashion to deal with the looming insolvency of Social Security and Medicare?
Yeah, and we put a Medicare proposal forward and hope to work with you. And the president has supported policies on Social Security, so absolutely, both parties will have to come together and talk about the trust funds.
Okay, well, that's a really big step in the right direction, because I think when you look at the pie chart, it's impossible really to get us in a good budget space, and these programs, Medicare and Social Security, is certainly worth saving, and I would like to be part of the effort to do that, so we'll see if we can make some progress on that front. Now, about the budget before us here today, inflation's at 6%. Do you agree that's about right?
Yes, Senator, down from over 9%.
Yeah, no, 6% down from 9%. Who gave us the number 6%?
We look at the CPI report.
Is that the administration?
That is not from us.
Okay, who's it from?
Do we? have Bureau of Labor Statistics, so it is ours.
So I accept that. I assume that's pretty accurate. 4.7 trillion in taxes in this budget increases, is that right?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. When you say 25% tax on billionaires, if you buy an asset at $1 for simplification, and it appreciates to $3, but you haven't sold it yet, would the president's budget propose taxing that unrealized gain?
It would, but we would say, because these things have ebbs and flows, it makes sense to do it over a long period of time. So
Okay.
we would
But you
suggest
will be
looking at
taxing.
absolutely. Remember, a lot of those unrealized gains are used to
Do
go to
you think
banks
that
and
will
take
hurt
loans
in-
on things.
Do you think that will hurt investing, or?
Look, this president's been very clear, Senator Graham. He believes we tried trickle down.
Yeah.
It did not work.
Well,
And he is about investing in the middle class. He believes
Yeah,
we can grow the
sure.
economy best from the middle class and working families.
Yeah, I got you. Couldn't disagree more, but I understand where you're coming from. Now, you dispute that this budget increases non-defense spending by 8.5%, is that correct?
I have 7.3%, Senator.
Okay. And CBO's at 8.5?
CBO has not scored the president's budget yet.
Okay, where does this 8.5 number come from? Is that our analysis on the committee here on our
Maybe,
side? Yeah.
maybe.
So you're saying it's 7.3%?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, we'll see if that holds up. In this budget, defense increase is 3.3%, is that correct?
That's correct.
So in this budget, we're increasing defense spending from last year under inflation.
So, Senator, I know you and I go back and forth on this, but remember in December, defense grew about 10%. Some things.
That's why I voted for it.
Yeah, some things not necessarily administration priorities that we think would fully fund the national defense strategy.
No, I got you. I'm just asking you a really simple question. Inflation is 6%. The defense budget increase by the administration's 3.3. Those two numbers are accurate?
I'm saying we are reprioritizing some of the funding.
No, I mean, if I got the numbers right.
You have the top lines right, but
Okay,
we go
all right.
into the December and reprioritize.
And I'll just end with this effort here. You do not agree with the proposition that a 3.3% increase for defense spending when inflation is at 6% is increasing defense spending less than inflation?
Absolutely not. We reprioritize and we pay for inflation based
Wow.
on our economic assumptions in the budget.
Well. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Senator Padilla, and then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Young, good to see you.
Good to see you.
As you know, despite all the recent rain in the state of California and other areas of the West, we still face a crisis on the Colorado River. As drying conditions bring water reservoirs along the Colorado River to dangerously low levels, that means that 40 million Americans and farms across 7 states face severe threats to their water supply. And just to drive home the point, when I reference the farms in the West, I'm speaking to a key segment of our nation's food supply. So I want to first thank you for OMB's role in facilitating the administration's commitment to invest $250 million from the Inflation Reduction Act to address the public health and environmental disasters at the Salton Sea. Now, because of drought conditions, changing agricultural practices, and efforts to stabilize the Colorado River Basin, more and more of the lake bed of the Salton Sea is exposed due to decreased flows, which causes toxic clouds of dust and pesticides, and this pollution spreads for miles, goes airborne for miles. Addressing the Salton Sea is a critical linchpin of securing long-term deals to address water use in the Colorado River Basin. Second, the $4 billion included in the Inflation Reduction Act for the Colorado River, I think, should be just seen as a down payment given the magnitude of the crisis facing the 7 states. It's going a long way. It was put to urgent good use, but it's a one-time investment in an ongoing concern. So my question is this: how is the OMB working with the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and other agencies to leverage Inflation Reduction Act and other funding as part of a whole of government approach to addressing the challenges facing the Colorado River?
Well, one, we understand the problem. The Colorado River Basin impacts 40 million Americans, 7 states. It is a complex problem, and it will take a whole of government approach. And OMB is situated to be able to bring the various agencies together and make sure that we are putting our best minds and creativeness to this problem. As you pointed out, this needs to be reimagined for the long term. And we appreciate the infrastructure and the IRA funds. They're helping get us started, and without those, I don't know where we would be. But this has to be a long systemic change in how the government views the Colorado River Basin. And we're committed to doing that with your partnership.
Thank you. I'll tell you where we would be without these investments. We'd be in dire straits. That's exactly where we would be. And another data point to underscore: half of the 40 million Americans who rely on the Colorado River are in California. So, on a related issue, Director Young, during your confirmation hearing, which probably at this point seems like a decade ago to you, I raised an issue of a specific Army Corps project to improve levees along the Pajaro River near Watsonville, California. I raised it then as an issue of equity. The Pajaro River project was long overlooked because it would protect a low-income community with low property values. Now, it may or may not have been a conscious ignoring of that low-income community, but my point is the systemic consideration of these factors by the Army Corps of Engineers. Their rigid benefit-cost ratio formula systemically disadvantages projects that would protect communities like this one. So I was proud to help secure $82 million in the bipartisan infrastructure law to begin the project to reinforce the levees in this historically underserved and largely farm worker community of Pajaro, California. And unfortunately, I imagine you've seen the images for days now. Mother Nature did not wait for the Corps to complete its work. This past week, the levee broke, flooding the town and displacing hundreds of households. And many of the residents are now out of work long-term because nearby fields remain underwater. And these families won't be able to return to their homes probably for months. Director Young, you and I have talked about the need to address how the Army Corps, as well as OMB, should be thinking beyond just the benefit-cost ratio in order to ensure we're protecting vulnerable communities equitably. How can we shift the federal government's approach to ensure that communities like Pajaro and Watsonville receive the resources they need before it's too late?
Yeah, well, one, you're talking to a child of South Louisiana. I pulled out more drywall than a human should have to, and it's devastating to families and communities. And those communities are more than a benefit-cost ratio. And you have my commitment to work with you in Congress to make sure there is change beyond when I'm in this seat, to make sure that we're looking at a way to be absolutely cost-conscious, because there's never enough money, even with the infrastructure law. Lots of communities have flood control projects that we can't get to. So we do have to be cost-effective, but this idea that poor communities don't deserve the same flood control protection as those with higher value in houses is just patently unfair. So I'm sorry we got there too late to those communities, but you know, I certainly want to work with you and see what we can do to systemically change this for the future.
Okay. Senator Lee. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being here. I want to start out by correcting the record. One of our colleagues made a comment moments ago suggesting the House Freedom Caucus has proposed and is actively pushing a 30% national sales tax. It's just not true. House Freedom Caucus has one member who asked for a vote on something like that, but the Freedom Caucus itself doesn't do that, nor would the Freedom Caucus support that in the absence of a full repeal of the 16th Amendment, which seems, let's just say, unlikely at the moment. I do, however, applaud the House Freedom Caucus for the work that it's done in proposing ideas to get us on a sustainable spending trajectory. They recently proposed, in fact, that Congress should be responsibly reducing spending growth rates. The biggest problem we've got is the rate at which government spending grows is faster than the rate of increase, the rate of economic growth within our country. And if we took care of that in time, we could get to balance over the course of a few years. They've also identified some areas where cuts would be appropriate, particularly on the discretionary side of the budget, while enacting meaningful regulatory reform to make sure that Congress, and not unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, will have ultimate decision-making responsibility over regulations that affect economic growth and ultimately revenue. I do want to remind everyone, anyone watching this hearing, as well as American taxpayers more broadly, that it's Congress that ultimately determines annual spending and revenue levels, not the President's annual budget. Although required by law, the budget request of the President that he submits annually to Congress has long been a political messaging document reflecting the policy goals and ambitions of the current President's administration. And it should be noted that many of the largest policies embedded in this particular request have zero chance of becoming law, particularly in the current divided Congress, and with good reason. President Biden's FY24 budget message to Congress alludes preposterously to, quote, delivering on his commitment to fiscal responsibility, close quote. And then it quite misleadingly makes a claim in an effort to claim credit for reducing the FY 2022 budget deficit to $1.4 trillion from the record high $3 trillion budget deficits in both FY 20 and FY 21. To provide actual context and to set the record straight on this, remember that FY 20's deficit included roughly $2 trillion in deficit-financed COVID relief from early 2020, something that was passed in both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support. FY 21's deficit included most of the $2 trillion cost of the deficit-financed spending bonanza that congressional Democrats and President Biden enacted without a single Republican supporting, at a time in March 2021 when inflation was still below 2% and the economy was already well on its way to recovery. FY 22's sharp deficit decline is solely attributable to the expiration of pandemic spending, and yet it was still hundreds of billions of dollars greater than what CBO projected pre-pandemic. I'd further add that I find it curious, if not troubling, that the President claims to be a steward of fiscal responsibility, with a track record on deficit and debt accumulation in the last 2 years, during which there was Democratic control of both the House and the Senate. His claims there don't add up. Director Young, this budget request proposes even more spending over the next 10 years than current law projections would suggest. We obviously disagree on that point, you and I do, but I'd be curious to know what, if any, proposed programmatic spending cuts or spending freezes the last, at a minimum on the discretionary side, are contained within this budget. Can you identify any of those?
We have an entire fact sheet I'm happy to share with this committee about what spending cuts this president would take on. One, pharma, paying pharma less by negotiating prescription drugs and saving the American taxpayer $160 billion. Also closing tax loopholes for big oil. We had
Those
a
aren't
profit of
spending
$200
cuts,
billion.
those are tax increases, but.
No,
yeah.
I mean, our tax cuts, do they not cost the American people?
Yeah, we use different accounting terms, different language to describe those. I'm asking specifically about.
They add to the deficit, Senator. So we believe the appropriate thing to do is to close those tax loopholes.
Understood. Now, with non-defense discretionary spending, $661 billion in FY19 before the pandemic. The president's budget calls for $1 trillion for non-defense discretionary spending in FY24. This is completely unrealistic as an increase, even from the FY2023 levels. And I endorse wholeheartedly the Freedom Caucus proposal to cap non-defense discretionary spending. Would the president ever consider capping non-defense discretionary spending? And if not, why not?
Well, one, those aren't the correct numbers. Non-defense discretionary in the president's budget for 24 is $688 billion, compared to $886 billion for defense and $121 billion for VA medical care.
Look,
Senator Lee, your time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Director Young. We have a vote to get to, so I'm going to conclude the hearing. I appreciate very much your testimony here. Anybody who has questions for the record has until noon tomorrow to get those questions in, and we'd ask you to try to respond to them within 7 days of receipt. I'll just conclude by thanking you very much for the President's attention to the blatant injustice of the tax code. It is the product of the power of big special interests and wealthy donors. Enormous amounts of money go out the back door of the tax code to benefit the wealthiest corporations and people in this country. The number you used of an 8% tax rate for the 400 biggest tax filers, the 400 number has long been a terrible problem, and it means that those super wealthy tax filers are paying lower tax rates than their limo drivers, lower tax rates than their private jet pilots, lower tax rates than their household staff, and as Warren Buffett famously observed, he paid lower tax rates than his office staff. That has to stop, not just as a matter of economic probity, but as a matter of simple decency and justice. So thank you for keeping the pedal to the metal on that. And with that, the hearing is concluded.